What is up, everybody? It's 414 Anime here for Anime Uproar, and today I'll be breaking down just how strong series protagonist Ichigo Kurosaki is from the Bleach series. There is certainly a lot to cover here, so in this video we will be breaking down Ichigo's strength by looking into his powers, abilities, fights, and more, so make sure to stay tuned for this one. We have made a few Bleach videos on the channel now, including a video covering every Bankai in Bleach, so make sure to check that video out after this one. Link to that is in the video description. Now, if you do enjoy these Bleach videos on the channel and you'd like to see more, you know what to do. Smash that like button, as it really does help us out with that YouTube algorithm. If you haven't already, make this the video that you subscribe and hit that notification bell to turn on all notifications. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Anime Uproar. And now, without further ado, let's jump into it, spoilers and all. Ichigo Kurosaki is 15 years old when we are first introduced to him in the series, and is currently 29 years old. He stands at 181 centimeters or 5 foot 11 inches at present. Ichigo is the son of Isshin and Masaki Kurosaki, and the older brother of both Karin and Yuzu. He is now married to Orihime Onoe and has a son of his own called Kazui Kurosaki. So we saw from the very beginning of the series that Ichigo knew how to handle himself in a fight, and that lad did love a good scrap, to be honest. He would often get bullied for the colour of his hair, which he said made him stand out as a bit of a target, so he had no choice other than to stand up for himself. Not only would Ichigo stand up for himself, but he would also stand up for others that he felt were in need of protecting. Ichigo has always had a good sense of doing the right thing, and his very name, according to his father Isshin, means he who protects. Now, for all of Ichigo's incredible power and ability, I feel like his hand-to-hand combat goes under the radar a little bit, which is easily overlooked as the series does put a large amount of its focus on the Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto, or the special abilities that these characters possess. We do know that Ichigo was trained in martial arts from a very young age, as he attended the very same dojo as Tatsuki. Not only was he trained in martial arts, but he had many mini skirmishes with his dad Isshin, which were, played to us viewers as comedic moments where Isshin would ambush Ichigo in the morning or at random moments and so on. But now we look at these little fights as Isshin training Ichigo's instincts, his intuition, and fighting abilities when it comes to coordination and execution of his own attacks. We also saw very early on in the series that Ichigo was already physically strong himself prior to receiving his Soul Reaper powers. He kept his body in very good shape and could deliver very powerful punches and kicks, as well as being able to take down multiple bullies on his own with no effort on a very regular basis. In the very first episode or chapter, we saw Ichigo crush a man's skull through concrete with just a single kick. In fact, I remember Ichigo utilizing a lot of kicks in those very early episodes or chapters. Now, not only was Ichigo already physically strong at this time, but his speed and reflexes were honed really well, and again, this was before his Soul Reaper powers and him learning Shunpo. Ichigo was fast and agile. He could dodge a bully's strike and instantly hit them on the counterattack. So this hand-to-hand combat experience and training for me really does add to Ichigo's power. Yes, it's not the big flashy finishing move or anything, but a great example of when his hand-to-hand combat was absolutely boss post receiving his Soul Reaper powers has to be in the Soul Society after he had achieved Bankai. We saw Ichigo arrive at the execution ground to save Rukia. After destroying the Sogyoku and making a run for it with Rukia and Renji, in an instant his physical strength and great speed when it comes to hand-to-hand combat was showcased when Ichigo took down 3 lieutenants that were dispatched after them, that being Squad 4's Isane, Squad 2's Omeda, and Squad 1's Sasakibe. After taking them all down with single hits, he then picked his Zanpakuto up to block an incoming attack from Byakuya Kuchiki in Ichigo's blind spot, which was very impressive. Ichigo is of course a bit of an all-rounder when it comes to who he is and in such his powers and abilities, but I wanted to highlight that even physical hand-to-hand combat plays a part in what makes Ichigo such a strong and powerful character, and how it has been fused into his style of combat. We have of course seen him use hand-to-hand combat in some occasions throughout the show, but that moment in the Soul Society arc had to be one of the key highlights when mentioning this aspect of his strength, as it was, for me, yes, such a big moment. I mean, you look at that moment and yes, maybe it's a big moment for other reasons, but when you look at it and break down what it is he did here, then you can't argue that it is indeed a contribution to the overall power that Ichigo possesses, and something that in aspects we will touch on again when it comes to his powers and abilities as he grows, especially when it comes to his Soul Reaper powers. Speaking of which, let's look at how Ichigo got said Soul Reaper powers. Now, from a very young age, Ichigo could see spirits. Now, no age exactly as to when this started, but Ichigo has said that he has been able to see and communicate with them for as long as he can remember. Now, at this young age, Ichigo did struggle to tell the difference between the living and the dead that he was seeing. One such occasion led to the tragedy of his mother's passing. One day on the way home, June 17th being the date of this fateful day, Ichigo, only aged 9 at the time, was with his mother walking along the riverbank on their way home. The weather was awful as the rain poured heavily. It was here that Ichigo saw a girl standing by the river. The girl looked as if she was about to jump in, so Ichigo ran out to try and save this girl. Unfortunately, said girl was not alive and technically not even dead for that matter, but the law of the hollow Grand Fissure. His mother Masaki tried her best to stop Ichigo, but he did not listen to her. His one and only priority was to protect. Ichigo, of course, failed to grab hold of the girl and fell unconscious. When he awoke, he saw the most tragic and life-changing thing, which was the body of his mother lying on top of him, covered in blood. This major event in Ichigo's life completely changed him and really began shaping him as the man he would become. So back to his ability to see spirits. Many people would see Ichigo in the strangest of places, seemingly talking to himself, but he was in fact talking to the spirits of the deceased. People would speak about it, and the rumors were that Ichigo could see ghosts. Little did they know that this was, of course, true. However, when Tatsuki questioned him on this, he straight out denied being able to see them. For Ichigo, he wanted to keep this to himself, especially as it was this ability to see the spirits of the dead that was an important part in the events that led to his mother Masaki's death. So this leads us to his first encounter with Rukia Kuchiki. When Ichigo first met her, she appeared in his bedroom and he thought that she was a burglar. Ichigo quickly realized, however, that he was the only one able to see this woman, so he simply accepted the fact that she was just another ghost. Of course, this was pretty standard practice for Ichigo at this point and was just another normal everyday thing. Rukia explained to Ichigo that she was a Soul Reaper and what a Soul Reaper was. But Ichigo refused to believe it and was rude to her in, typical Ichigo fashion, which led to Rukia binding him with Kido. It is of course at that moment that a hollow attacks the house, and we get to see another display of something that isn't necessarily a power, but something that Ichigo possesses that lends to his overall strength. That being his will. Ichigo's will, combined with his burning need to protect, allows him to overcome and defeat obstacles that any normal person cannot. It allows him to break barriers and push the boundaries of his own abilities at their current state at that time. This of course excels his growth and taps into that untouched potential that he of course has. And I mean, yeah, you can really argue that this is a classic shonen trait, but let us not forget that Ichigo is a protagonist of one of the big 3 shonen series, so you really can't argue with him having this as a part of his personality, or powers and abilities. Both. Now, this willpower and the need to protect kicks in here as he hears the screams of his younger sisters Karin and Yuzuru, both who are pleading for help. This fires Ichigo up, and his determination to get out there and save them allows him to break free of Rukia's Kido spell, and he rushes to stop the hollow. This was of course the first time Ichigo ever saw a hollow, in this form anyway. but he was shocked and surprised by just how monstrous it looked. Nonetheless, he dove in to help save Yuzuru, who was being held captive. Rukia is also involved in the fight as a Soul Reaper naturally, however Ichigo acts recklessly, which again is another trait that is both a strength and weakness when it comes to Ichigo's overall power. In this case, it is a very strong weakness, as Rukia had to shield him with her own body, which leaves her badly injured. Now, in this most dire of situation, this is the first time Rukia sees the fiery determination in Ichigo's eyes to protect. Inspired by this, and in this terrible situation, Rukia offers to turn Ichigo into a Soul Reaper temporarily so that he can save them all from the foe at hand. She pierces his chest with her Zanpakuto, transferring half of her own power to him, which allows Ichigo to take on the form of a Soul Reaper and make short work of the Hollow. Now, this may be jumping way into the future of the series here, but there are definitely moments sprinkled in the early stages of the story and in the Soul Society that are a nod or foreshadowing to Ichigo's powers, abilities, and I guess identity for that matter, that we would have 100% overlooked or ignored when we first saw or read the series. The first being this instance right here, where Rukia gives Ichigo half of her powers. So, Ichigo actually has the ability to absorb Reishi, which is an ability that the Quincy possess. Quincy's gain their power by absorbing the Reishi around them. Ichigo's mother was a Quincy herself, thus Ichigo himself is half Quincy, meaning that he has his own set of Quincy powers, including this one right here. So in this instance, Rukia intended and stated to only give Ichigo half of her power, but because of this ability, Ichigo unintentionally took all of it. So now a substitute Soul Reaper, Ichigo dons the Soul Reaper attire and Zanpakuto. This Zanpakuto is similar to that of Rukia's, however it is much larger in size. This size is all down to the fact that at this time, Ichigo couldn't control the insane amount of spirit power that he possessed, and as such, this blade in particular was pretty weak, since very little of his own spirit power was used to create it. To elaborate here, the Zanpakuto is a representation and extension, I guess you could say, of its wielder, and the best way to look at this sword is that it is more a representation of the stolen spirit energy of Rukia's than his own power. Nonetheless, it did allow Ichigo to get the job done against the lesser hollows that he was taking down around Karakura Town. Now, Ichigo's biggest test in this time was against the Menos Grande that was summoned in his face-off with Uryu. Uryu had of course challenged Ichigo to see who could finish off the most hollows by using a bait that drew more in. Now, in this battle against the Menos, we got another snippet or foreshadowing of Ichigo's Quincy abilities. Ichigo again displayed his ability to absorb Reishi by taking in the Menos' Seto and then fire it right back at it. This attack of course injures the Menos enough to retreat, and Ichigo claims the victory here. It was also during this battle that Uryu takes note of Ichigo's overwhelming spirit power. He saw that Ichigo's spiritual pressure continued to rise as he took the Sero, despite Ichigo himself saying that he was already emitting his full power. Impressive as this feat was, let's not forget that Menos Grande are considered captain-leveled hollows. Ichigo was 100% not at that level at the time. Remember, the Menos wasn't defeated, it simply retreated through an injury I'm sure it wasn't expecting. Ichigo not being at that level, of course, is backed up when he came face to face with his first lieutenant and captain ranked Soul Reapers in Renji Abarai and Byakuya Kuchiki, the two who had come to the world of the living to retrieve Rukia. This is a very important encounter, and we see a couple of things here. The first being Ichigo's severe lack of both knowledge and I guess you can argue experience at this point, especially compared to the two powerhouses that were standing before him. Ichigo learns of the bond a Soul Reaper has with its Zanpakuto in terms of knowing its name and the fact that the Zanpakuto has release stages. The released stages he of course got first-hand experience from in the form of Renji's Shikai. We did get to see Ichigo's spirit pressure dramatically increase, so much so that he managed to both injure and overwhelm Renji. However, this is when Byakuya steps in, literally, with his flash step. Byakuya not only cuts clean through Ichigo's sword, but he also performed one of his favorite and most devastating techniques. This technique being called Senka, or Flash Blossom when translated. Here, he moves at his opponent's back, directly attacking and sealing their Seketsu and Hakusui. This is done in two very rapid and devastating strikes, which cuts off their spiritual energy flow. Byakuya's Senka completely devastates Ichigo, leaving him on death's door, but we do get to see another of Ichigo's powers. That power being sheer determination and the will to just never give in. Byakuya is talking to Rukia as Ichigo grabs his leg and tells him not to talk about him as if he was dead. Byakuya tells him to let go, and Ichigo commands Byakuya to look at him when he is talking to him. Small moment, I guess, but a big one for me at the same time, as this really sums up Ichigo's personality in these crunch moments. To be strong, you can't really just rely on power alone, but it's also the mindset to see it through. However, this is still a defeat. Ichigo is later saved by Urahara and undergoes training to, 1, restore his lost Soul Reaper powers, and 2, prepare himself for the Soul Society, where they plan to save and rescue Rukia Kuchiki. Now, at this time, the important thing to note here is that Ichigo had little to no training at all at this point. He was pretty much thrown into the job and was learning as he went. It was techniques such as, the soul ribbons, for example. A simple technique, but one he had to pick up from people like Uryu, who of course isn't a Soul Reaper himself. So if you look back at this time and look at what he had accomplished with, such little knowledge and training, it's a very clear nod to the fact that Ichigo is a very quick learner and also one who has very rapid growth, but rapid growth is something we will touch on in just a sec. So on to Urahara's training. Ichigo underwent a few tests. The first was to get used to his soul form and regain his Soul Reaper powers that Byakuya had taken from him. In the first test, he had to learn how to move better in his soul body, better than that of his own body, and to do this he had to successfully dodge Ururu's attacks and then go on to counter. This test he of course passed, recovering his spirit energy, but the next one was very important and also very, very dangerous. So Ichigo's soul chain, or chain of fate, is cut and it begins to corrode. Urahara tells him that when the chain reaches his chest, Ichigo will become a hollow himself and thus will have to be exterminated. However, he can avoid this fate if he manages to become a Soul Reaper instead. Ichigo is then thrown into what Urahara calls the Shattered Shaft. He is then bound by a Kido spell and has to escape the deep shaft before his chain completely dissolves. Urahara also throws in the fact that there is gas at the bottom of this shaft that excels the corrosion process, and that Ichigo has 72 hours at most to complete this task. Of course, after a few failed attempts and a whole lot of pain, the chain does reach his chest, to which a large hole opens and a hollow mask begins to form on his face. It is here that Ichigo blacks out and awakens inside his own consciousness, his inner world, of course, if you will. It is here that he meets a man standing on a building who reveals his name to Ichigo, however Ichigo cannot hear it. The man also reveals to Ichigo that Byakuya had destroyed the powers that were given to him by Rukia Kuchiki. However, he does have his own Soul Reaper powers and that now is the time for him to find them. The buildings in his inner world begin to crumble away and many boxes appear, with one of them containing his Soul Reaper powers. Ichigo must choose the right one or it is game over. He wonders to himself in a panic how he will manage to pick the right one before remembering the red ribbon lesson that he had learnt from Uryu. He follows the red ribbon to a box that reveals the hilt of his Zanpakuto and he pulls it from the box. Back in the real world, smoke clears and Ichigo is revealed to have made it through the test wearing Soul Reaper clothes, however he does have a hollow mask. We get to see a real badass moment here where Ichigo uses the hilt of his Zanpakuto to smash the hollow mask he is wearing, revealing that he had indeed passed the test. This of course moves us on to the third test, which is to knock off Urahara's hat with his Zanpakuto in a 5-minute time limit. Urahara unleashes his Shikai Benihime while Ichigo still wields the stub of his Zanpakuto. Urahara completely overwhelms Ichigo and even cuts the stub of his blade further until only the hilt remains. Ichigo begins to panic here, thinking that he can't fight with just a hilt, and if he does, Urahara will most certainly kill him. He runs away until the man from his inner world is standing before him, which halts Ichigo in his tracks. The man asks Ichigo why he is running and also reveals his name to him again. This time, Ichigo hears the name Zangetsu. Ichigo turns to face Urahara and calls out Zangetsu's name, which activates his Shikai, revealing its new form. Ichigo tells Urahara he may not be able to hold back before swinging a large energy blast straight at Urahara, who manages to pull up his blood mist shield just in the nick of time. Urahara's hat is blown clean off his head, but he states that he would have lost an arm if he didn't get the shield up in time, and thus, Ichigo completes the third test. So this is a good time to talk about Ichigo's Shikai here. The appearance of his Zanpakuto is like that of a huge kaiba knife that's hilt has a long cloth wrapped around it. The blade is black with a silver edge and just as tall as Ichigo is. Now the cloth wrapped around it is also said to react to Ichigo's will and that it can change in length. This cloth can also be used to swing the blade around, a technique that he doesn't learn until later when he encounters his hollow self in his inner world in the battle against Captain Kenpachi Zaraki. The blade is also super wide, just as it is tall, to which Ichigo has used his Zanpakuto as a sort of shield in some occasions to block incoming enemy attacks. Now, Ichigo's Zanpakuto is a full-time released form due to the huge amount of spirit energy that Ichigo possesses. It is so vast that he can't control the Zanpakuto into its sealed state. Right, so we are moving on to the Soul Society here. This is an arc where we see major growth in Ichigo's powers and abilities. From the very beginning, we get to see just how much of an improvement he has made in his short training sessions with Urahara when he faced off against the giant gatekeeper Jidambo, a foe who he easily defeats. We see in this battle that his Soul Reaper powers are a lot more refined, as are all of his other attributes. We talked at the start of the video about Ichigo's physical strength being impressive prior to him gaining his Soul Reaper powers, but when he is in his Soul Reaper form, this physical strength is far more enhanced and with his body toned. We saw him easily stop Jidambo's axe before completely destroying them with just a single blow. His already impressive punches and kicks are also significantly boosted in their strength, allowing Ichigo to kick down concrete walls with absolute ease. Along with this, his endurance and durability are noticeably enhanced, as Ichigo has been seen to continue fighting to an effective manner even after sustaining multiple injuries that would completely take out a normal person. Rukia herself had stated that a Soul Reaper's life force is tied to their spiritual pressure, and as we know, Ichigo certainly has a lot of that going on. So with that information, we know that not only can he withstand attacks that would kill a human, but also attacks that would immobilize that of a normal Soul Reaper. Now, his first real test upon getting into the Serite was the then third seat of the 11th Division, Ikkaku Madarame. Their fight was a really awesome one to watch. Two ferocious fighters going at it against one another with a level of respect for each of the fighters tied within. What this fight did showcase was Ichigo's intellect. Ichigo is very headstrong and his emotions are ultimately the fuel behind his power for the vast majority. We have known him to be reckless, overconfident, and someone that can just rush straight into things, but in this battle, we saw his analytical and deductive side as he studied both Ikkaku's fighting style and his Zanpakuto. Combining his calm deductive knowledge with his own brute strength, Ichigo was able to counter and beat Ikkaku in a battle that really did showcase how far Ichigo had come in such a short time, as is the theme with the Soul Society arc. This fight also gave us a good look at Ichigo's swordsmanship. His fighting style is heavily dependent on the sword, though he will throw in his physicality too. He mainly wields his Zanpakuto in his right hand or will take up a stance where he has both hands on the hilt of his blade, but he has also been seen on some occasions to wield his Zanpakuto in his left hand. This tells us that he is somewhat ambidextrous, which is an invaluable trait in battle when it comes to adjusting your own battle strategy to combat your opponent mid-battle. Ichigo, though with training under his belt, still lacks in the experience and training that those in the Soul Society have, and still has a lot to learn as he goes, but his style really has developed through combat experience rather than that of formal training. The stronger the opponent, the better Ichigo gets. Now, I've always likened Ichigo to the Saiyans in Dragon Ball, where they gain way more experience through combat than in training, and that they also get significantly stronger after suffering a defeat. Ichigo is very much the same here. He tends to learn the most important lessons when he is on the back foot or in the aftermath of a defeat. It's in these moments where Ichigo really undergoes a level up, and with each and every fight, he becomes much more powerful himself. Now, the further through the Serite he went, the more attention and interest he was gaining from the other Soul Reapers. Of course, most noticeably the captain of the 11th Division, who was desperately hunting down Ichigo like a dog. But there was an opponent Ichigo faced before him, who indeed proved to be his ultimate test at this point, which was Division 6 Lieutenant Renji Abarai. This fight was a true test of how far Ichigo had come, not only because Renji was a lieutenant level, but also because of the past exchange that the two had had. However, Renji is a completely different beast in this fight, as he reveals that when in the world of the living, lieutenants and captains have their powers capped, but here in the Soul Society, man, anything goes, especially during these wartime rules they had going on. Renji proves to be more than a challenge for Ichigo at this point, as he injures Ichigo greatly with his Shikai Sabimaru. Now, as I previously mentioned, when comparing Ichigo to the Saiyans in Dragon Ball, Ichigo gets stronger and stronger during the fight, and we see the pinnacle of his training with Urahara on full show here. That being Ichigo's resolve. Ichigo completely destroys Renji with a very powerful Getsuga Tensho attack, giving our boy a huge win in the arc at this point. Getsuga Tensho is without a doubt one of the most famous attacks in the world of anime, and of course Ichigo's signature attack. Getsuga Tensho is translated as meaning Moonfang Heaven Piercer or Piercer of Heaven in the anime. What it is a slash of condensed spiritual energy that is fired at his opponent in the shape of a crescent moon that strikes his opponent with such devastating force, dealing a lot of damage to them. Ichigo was actually using this technique without knowing its name for a while, such as in the fight with Renji, but later learns the name and masters the technique during his Bankai training. Zangetsu stated that by knowing the name of a technique, it will significantly increase its power and effectiveness. Now, as the show progresses, we do learn more about the Getsuga Tensho that I will cover as we move along, and we have seen it grow in its power as well as, in the way that Ichigo uses it, but it's just one of those anime attacks that gets you hyped when you hear the name. That's for sure. Right, the next big moment for Ichigo comes in his battle against Kenpachi. A battle so ferocious with a lot of improvement from Ichigo on show, and to this day, one of the best fights in all of Bleach. In my opinion anyway. Let me know in the comments if you think the same. So initially, we see a completely different side to Ichigo in this fight, as he is struck and frozen by a sense of complete fear. Kenpachi is an absolute brute force and has such an intense and ultimately horrifying force about him that is, to no surprise that Ichigo feels this way. Kenpachi is easily one of the worst captains to come up against as your first. Kenpachi toyed with Ichigo, allowing him a free strike, to which Ichigo's blade simply hit Kenpachi but left Ichigo as the one who was bleeding. Kenpachi was utterly disappointed with Ichigo, as he wanted a worthy opponent to fight against, but Ichigo was proving to be very far from that. Struggling to cut Kenpachi, Ichigo was left with a very fatal injury as Kenpachi walked away from the fight, only for Zangetsu to come to Ichigo's aid in more ways than one. Zangetsu pulled Ichigo into his inner world and was able to stop the bleeding from the wound that Ichigo had just suffered, but only for a short period of time. This is all because the old man is the representation of Ichigo's Quincy powers, and this ability is from that branch of powers he has. It's also another reason as to why Ichigo can withstand and take on a lot of damage. Anyway, the other way he aided Ichigo here was by repairing his resolve, but first he had to prove to Zangetsu that he was worthy of wielding him. In order for Ichigo to prove this, he was tasked with taking the Zangetsu blade back in a fight with his inner hollow, using a nameless normal katana. Ichigo succeeds in doing this, but learns some important lessons, such as the fact that Ichigo had always thought about himself in battle, rather than drawing out the power of Zangetsu to aid him and fight together. Fighting together with your Zanpakuto, of course, being, the main theme of Ichigo and Kenpachi's battle. Kenpachi relies solely on himself and doesn't know the name of his Zanpakuto, whereas Ichigo fights together with Zangetsu in order to draw upon his power, and the two fighters won. Ichigo also learns about how he can use the cloth of his Zanpakuto to swing his weapon, something he had never considered himself, but was shown just how devastating attack it can be by the hollow Ichigo. Now worthy to wield him, Ichigo awakens and the fight with Kenpachi resumes as both fighters go all out against each other. Kenpachi unleashes his full power by removing his eye patch, and Ichigo and Zangetsu work together to bring out their maximum at this time, which technically does end in a draw here, however Kenpachi gifts the win to Ichigo. This was such an amazing and important fight for Ichigo, as this unlocks so much more of his potential by learning to work together with his Zanpakuto rather than simply using it as a tool to fight. Now, after this fight, Ichigo is partially healed by Yoruichi before Ichigo rushes after Gonju and Hanataro's aid, who are currently being confronted by none other than Byakuya Kuchiki. Ichigo, of course, makes the classic shonen protagonist entrance, which shocks Captain Joshiro Ukitake, who is with Byakuya here. He starts to state that this man is someone of captain level, to which Byakuya quickly shuts him down. Yes, Ichigo has gained incredible strength here, especially after the Kenpachi fight, but he is certainly not captain level just yet. I feel Ukitake was thrown off by Ichigo's insane spirit pressure and spiritual power, as well as the fact that his Soul Reaper powers come from his father's side. Ichigo Kurosaki, was a former captain of the 10th Division, whose spirit energy Ukitake probably recognized straight away, as would a few of the other captains. It's of course been mentioned a few times throughout the video, and it certainly won't be the last, but what is a huge factor in Ichigo's overall power is his very vast spiritual power. His spirit power has been described as almost immeasurable, and well beyond that of a normal Soul Reaper. It has even been described as feeling heavy, something the average Soul Reapers does not give off, which was the main thing that threw Renji off about Ichigo when they first met, giving Ichigo that opening that he needed. So yeah, he gives off the level of spiritual pressure a captain would have, but his power did not match that level at all just yet. The problem at hand for Ichigo is of course control over this spirit energy and the lack of training when it comes to being able to handle it. Events in the story at this point have just happened so fast, and Ichigo has just been thrust straight into the action. The problem he also has here is that he has way more spiritual power than his body can handle, so it is constantly rushing out of him, which would make him awful at stealth missions, but that's never been Ichigo's style, thankfully. This lack of training that had been mentioned will eventually cease as he does learn to control his spirit energy later on down the road to do things such as boost his own strength, to use it as a barrier defensively, and so on. But back to Ichigo confronting Byakuya here. This is a very evident improvement of him, from their first meeting, which does catch Byakuya off guard, but not enough to worry him. If this fight were to continue, Ichigo would most definitely have lost, but luckily Yoruichi showed up just in time to stop the fight. Knowing he is not ready to take on an enemy of Byakuya's power, she rushes him away to undergo Bankai training and tells Byakuya that she will make Ichigo stronger than he is in only 3 days. Ichigo is taken to an underground and unknown to the Soul Society location where he can undergo said Bankai training. Now, achieving Bankai is no easy feat. It is something that not just anyone can achieve. It usually takes someone of captain level quality or above with training of 100 years or more to achieve the Bankai release alone, and then a further 10 years of training to perfect it. So how is Ichigo going to do it in just 3 days? Well, luckily Kisuke Urahara had come up with an invention called the Tenshitai, translated as meaning divine transfer body. This forces the physical manifestation of the Zanpakuto's spirit. However, this manifestation will only last for 3 days before it reverts back into the doll from where it was initially spawned. Without this method, it would have been next to impossible to achieve Bankai. Luckily, Ichigo managed to achieve Bankai in only 2.5 days, which was actually quicker than Urahara, who had used the same technique to achieve Bankai himself in the 3 days. Not only did Ichigo achieve Bankai, but he also improved a lot in all of his other fighting aspects. This is all due to Ichigo's advanced growth. Now, Ichigo's advanced growth is arguably his most powerful ability, as stated by both Urahara and Aizen himself. Ichigo has the ability to get the basic gist of a very advanced technique in a matter of days that would usually take years for even the most gifted of Soul Reapers in the Soul Society. This is how he has been able to get as far as he has without any training. Ichigo tends to grasp an ability very quickly through sheer instinct. His ability to achieve Bankai in only 2.5 days is a very perfect example of this. Yes, he had the 10 Shintai, but it is a very dangerous way of achieving Bankai, and he still had to do it within that 3-day time limit. So let's talk about Ichigo's Bankai. Ichigo's Bankai is called Tenza Zangetsu, which is translated to mean Heaven Chain Slaying Moon. With the release of his Bankai, Ichigo's sword shrinks down to a pure black daito, which is a Japanese longsword with its cross guard being 4 prongs that form the shape of the manji, which is the kanji for ban. This means full, which in the instance of Bankai is full release. The cloth that was once part of his Shikai is also replaced with that of a black chain. Now, his Zanpakuto is said to be completely out of the ordinary when it comes to his Bankai, as a normal Zanpakuto's Bankai will either summon a huge monster or produce a certain effect. Ichigo's sword is also incredibly strong in its Bankai form, as it can cut through nearly anything and also withstand the strongest attacks. We must also mention that Ichigo's robes are also replaced with a very sleek looking long sleeve black cloak with a red lining and ripped ends similar to that of Zangetsu's looks. Now, this cloak is actually a part of his Bankai, as it is made of his spiritual energy and is a representation of just how much remaining strength and power that he has left. In terms of its power and abilities, Tenza Zangetsu is a huge power-up when it comes to Ichigo's strength and spiritual power that is used for heavy melee combat. As well as this, his Bankai seriously beefs up his Getsuga Tensho, which is a black and red version in his Bankai. This brings us to an interesting thing about his Getsuga Tensho. So the Getsuga Tensho we have seen Ichigo use are interesting, and they tie into the powers that he has. The blue or white Getsuga Tensho taps into Ichigo's Quincy powers, as Zangetsu absorbs Ichigo's own spiritual power, firing that at his opponent in a condensed state. This works in the exact same way that a Quincy's bow and arrow works. Now, the red or black Getsuga Tensho is that of his Soul Reaper and Hollow powers. In his eventual fight with Byakuya, his inner Hollow takes over, and this is where he learns this version of the Getsuga Tensho. Rather than the Quincy version that absorbs Ichigo's spiritual power and shoots, the Shinigami and Hollow version is performed when the two work together to create the blast from both of their powers rather than through absorption. So back to Ichigo's Bankai. His Bankai allows him to perform hyper-speed combat, where he can take the power of his Bankai and compress it into a smaller form, which allows him to fight at insane speeds, increasing his Shunpo ability to the point where his movements create dozens of after images of himself. The compression of his Bankai's power also extends the duration in which he can use it, as it doesn't expel as much spiritual power as a normal Bankai. This, combined with just how much spiritual power he has, means that he can fight in his Bankai form for a very long time. We're jumping, of course, into the future a bit here, but from his final encounter with Grimmjow all the way up until Aizen's defeat, Ichigo maintained his Bankai for the whole of that time period, which was 3 months. There is a little more to Ichigo's Bankai, well, a lot more actually, but this is what we got for the vast part of the story until later. So Ichigo arrives at Rukia's execution, again in a very epic shonen protagonist manner, and here has an awesome moment that highlights just how far his skill in handling his spiritual power has progressed in those 3 days. Ichigo managed to stop and hold back the Sogyoku bird that was going to execute Rukia. The Sogyoku bird being a whole bird with the destructive power equivalent to that of 1 million Zanpakuto combined, and our boy managed to hold it off with his spiritual power. Big boy play. Big boy play right there. This of course moves us into one of the greatest fights in all of anime, which is his showdown with Byakuya Kuchiki. This fight is incredible and really has it all. Ichigo manages to back Byakuya into a position where he has to use his Bankai against him, but Ichigo manages to keep up with it by just using his Shikai. Byakuya does manage to get Ichigo to use his Tenza Zangetsu, which is the first time we got to see it, and man, was that super epic. So, with his Bankai released, Ichigo is able to completely outmaneuver Byakuya's Bankai until he eventually counters with his Senki technique. As the battle goes on, Ichigo starts to weaken, which does give Byakuya the opening he needs. So, as Ichigo is about to receive the final blow from Byakuya, Ichigo's inner hollow takes over and completely overwhelms Byakuya. This display of power was brutal and very, very intense. The inner hollow was bloodthirsty and ready to do whatever it wanted, and despite being able to get the win in this state, Ichigo manages to regain control, as this is not how he wants this to go down. Of course, this is not the way that Ichigo does things. Now, again in full control, Ichigo and Byakuya take up one final stance, one final clash between these two powerhouses. Ichigo comes out as the victor here, but barely. Byakuya is certainly no joke, and it took everything to come out on top, but still was a huge moment for Ichigo and his progression. He even earned respect from Byakuya, a man who had been nothing more than cold-hearted for as long as we knew him, but of course we find out his reasonings. The next area of focus when it comes to Ichigo's power has to be that of his hollowification. We saw glimpses of his hollow mask throughout the Soul Society, and of course the takeover in his battle with Byakuya. When we move on to the Arrancar arc, the main focus is on that of his hollowification and how he struggles to control his inner hollow. After failed battles, most notably against the Espada Grimmjow, Ichigo's confidence in himself and his ability to protect others is severely damaged. He goes into a really depressed state, but he knows there is a solution. In those said battles, Ichigo had managed to get the upper hand, though only temporarily, and this was through the power of his inner hollow taking over him. In order for Ichigo to defeat these new threats, to protect the ones he holds closest to him, and to get stronger, Ichigo needed to be able to control his inner hollow and gain access to its powers. To do this, he went to the Vizards, who were all able to control the power of their own hollowification, and thus his training began. Ichigo's inner hollow is seriously no joke, and he nearly killed Hiyori when she drew the inner hollow out of him. Ichigo was luckily stopped, but told that he needed to force his inner hollow into the very core of his soul. After some brief training, Ichigo is sent into his inner world to confront his inner hollow and subdue it. This is no easy task, as the other Vizards had to control Ichigo's body in the real world while he was in there that was rampaging and was truly a devastating sight to behold. Meanwhile, in his inner world, Ichigo was having a terrible time against his inner hollow. Instead of being able to do damage to his hollow, he ended up getting stabbed by it. During this confrontation, Ichigo learned that he lacked any fighting spirit and could only fight if he had a reason to do so. Upon realizing this, it got him out of his own head, out of the slump he was in, and he managed to subdue his inner hollow and complete the task he had set out to complete. Following this, his training was solely focused on increasing the time that he could stay in his hollow masked form. Which leads us to a good point in the video to talk about the hollowification powers that Ichigo has. So, Ichigo's hollow mask was originally a sign that his inner hollow had taken over him until he had completed his training in subduing his hollow. The mask now simply means that he is using the powers of his hollowification. In order for Ichigo to activate the power of his hollowification, he places his hand over his face and concentrates his spiritual power to manifest and summon the mask over his face. When the mask is donned, his eyes become black with yellow pupils, and his voice has a slight hollow echo to it. This voice sounds really haunting, and I loved that. I think it sounded awesome. Now, in terms of the mask's appearance, Ichigo's hollow mask is that of a gnarly looking skull that is white in colour and originally had 3 red stripes on its left side. As he learned to control the power and stay in the form for longer, more stripes began to appear on that same left side. The thickness of the lines had also increased after he managed to subdue his inner hollow. By the time he fought Grimmjow for the 3rd and final time, his mask had a total of 10 stripes. Later in his fight with Ulquiorra, Ichigo's mask changed again, where he had 2 vertical thick red stripes on either side of the mask. Now, when Ichigo taps into his holification, his hollow powers significantly boost all of his Shinigami powers. Ichigo's strength, speed, and durability stats all skyrocket, as we mainly see against Grimmjow. He was strong enough to overpower Grimmjow's Espada-class Zero. Ichigo was fast enough to completely overwhelm him, and his durability was showcased when Grimmjow threw Ichigo through multiple buildings and rubble, only for Ichigo to come out of that unharmed. Ichigo's combat style while in his holification form is a lot more ruthless. It's full on and focuses on completely overwhelming his enemy. His instincts are also heightened, however his recklessness is also. When holified, Ichigo completely disregards any injuries or wounds that he has suffered in the battle and goes on to attack. It's a lot less strategic when in this form and more about getting the job done quickly. The power of his Getsuga Tensho is a more augmented version when he is using his holification. The power, speed, size, and blast force are all dramatically increased. Pretty much to the point where it is extremely difficult to control, as it could injure anyone in the surrounding area, be them friend or foe. Ichigo's enhanced speed has allowed him to fire many Getsuga Tensho blasts all at once from different directions. Ulquiorra himself compared his Getsuga Tensho to a hollow Zero, but in particular that of a Zero Oscorus, which is a variation of the Zero used by the Espada in their released state. Now, when Ichigo combines both his Bankai and his holification powers, his Getsuga Tensho is said to be his most ultimate attack. Ichigo also has the ability to repair parts of his mask that have been chipped or damaged slightly, but only if he has enough spirit power to do so. We saw him do this in his fights with both Grimmjow and Ulquiorra. Now, the main problem Ichigo had with his holification was the duration of how long he could maintain his masked form. At first, it was literally only 4 seconds at a time. After the visored training, he managed to more than double this to 11 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it was often a small gap that would turn the tides of his battles. By his 3rd fight with Grimmjow, his time limit and power for that matter had greatly increased, and Ichigo could fight entire battles while wearing the mask. There was no given reason as to how this was achieved, but as we know, Ichigo's growth is second to none, and I have, many times compared him to the Saiyans of Dragon Ball. So if you think about the constant fights and setbacks he had leading up to that 3rd battle with Grimmjow, it makes perfect sense that he was also growing in power with the combat experience and, in some cases, losses. The time limit he had now, however, is unknown, but I'd imagine it is tied into how much spirit power Ichigo had at the time. Now, Ichigo also displayed the ability to re-summon his mask a second time after the time limit had ended. In the very early days of learning to control this power, it would automatically smash upon its re-summoning, but later, this ceases to be an issue. There's of course a little more to talk about when it comes to Ichigo's hollow powers, but that will tie in when we get to some of the key fights and moments he has, so we'll get into that as we make our way forward. Now, talking of key fights, we of course have to talk about his fights with the Espada Grimmjow. Grimmjow was an amazing character in himself, but he was also an amazing point in Ichigo's progression. He was a sort of roadblock that Ichigo had to overcome to not only get out of the funk that he was in post-Soul Society, but also in his path to being able to control his new hollow powers. Yes, Grimmjow was basically a boss character in the story at that point, but the fights that he and Ichigo had were more centered around Ichigo's progression, in my opinion. So his first fight was a total disaster in Ichigo's point of view. It technically went down as a draw, but Ichigo definitely took it as a loss. Grimmjow was just far too much for Ichigo at this point, as Ichigo's attacks had zero effect on him. The only one that produced any sort of damage was his black Getsuga Tensho, but as the fight was progressing, Ichigo's focus shifted into the fear that his inner hollow was going to take over him again. Luckily, it was Kaname Tozen forcing an enraged Grimmjow back to Wako Mundo that ended this fight before it got any worse. A month later, Ichigo faced off against Grimmjow again, but this time with his holification powers. At this point, Ichigo had a time limit of 11 seconds that he could stay in his masked form, which was more than enough to completely overwhelm the 6th ranked Espada. However, it was this time limit that determined the outcome in this fight. After the time limit had exceeded, Grimmjow was back on top. Ichigo was pinned to the floor and Grimmjow was about to finish Ichigo off for good with a Seto, only for Rukia to freeze his arm. Grimmjow's attention was then on her, and as he tried to kill her, Shinji stepped in, which forced Grimmjow to retreat. Now, their final battle came in Wako Mundo, where Grimmjow is desperate to fight Ichigo at his full power, to which Ichigo obliges. The tide of this battle went back and forth. One moment Ichigo was on top, the second Grimmjow had the advantage. In this fight, Ichigo managed to keep his hollow mask duration throughout the fight, which forced Grimmjow to use his resurrection. The battle continued to rage on, with both fighters taking and dishing out heavy damage. Grimmjow is about to deliver the fatal blow as Orihime yells out to Ichigo. She begs for him not to get hurt anymore, which gives Ichigo just the boost that he needed. In doing so, he managed to slash Grimmjow, who went into a rage because of the injury and used his strongest attack, Disgarian, which impaled Ichigo's stomach. Ichigo managed to overcome the attack and went on to deliver the final blow in the fight and finally claim the win. This moves us on to Ichigo's next opponent, and another one he had tussled with on quite a few occasions through that last arc. That being the 4th Espada, Ukiura. Where Grimmjow was a roadblock Ichigo had to overcome to progress mentally and attain his hollow powers, Ukiura was the big test of Ichigo's power. Not only was he the big test of his power, but there was also some really big moments involving Ichigo's hollow powers. Not only that, but Ukiura really rose the bar here when it came to the manner of opponents that Ichigo had faced up to this point. Yes, Ichigo had overcome some very strong opponents by this point, such as Renji, Kenpachi, Byakuya, and recently Grimmjow, but Ukiura took this to a new level. He was a terrifying power that completely eclipsed anything we had faced before and left us with the feeling that there was literally no way for Ichigo to overcome this. Ukiura delivered despair to us as viewers. Their fight is again a bit of a back and forth. When Ichigo puts on his hollow mask, he gains the upper hand against Ukiura. However, when the fight is moved to the top of Los Noches, Ukiura releases his Zanpakuto. Ichigo does manage to survive the attacks, but he quickly comes to the realization that Ukiura is now much more stronger and much more faster than he is now. The two have a conversation mid-battle that again speaks to the power of Ichigo's resolve, where Ukiura asks Ichigo why he won't give up despite the huge difference in the two's powers. Ichigo replies by saying that nothing he sees Ukiura do will ever stop him from fighting nor from giving up. Ukiura, of course, is having none of it, and his answer only sparks his desire to make Ichigo feel deep despair. Ukiura activates his resurrection and completely controls the battle before firing a Sero blast that goes straight through Ichigo's chest, which looks to be game over for Ichigo. Orihime is on hand to try and heal him, and she pleads with Ichigo to please help Uryu fight Ukiura. Her words, as always, reach Ichigo, and this sparks Ichigo's transformation into his new hollow form, known as the Vasto Lorde form. The Vasto Lorde form was insane, and this moment truly goes down as one of the best ever. Here, Ichigo's body is completely taken over by his inner hollow. However, this time it is a full transformation physically and is far more powerful than anything we had ever seen. Not only that, but the form looked amazing as Ichigo was pure white in color with a smaller hollow hole at his chest with black markings that went from that hole around to his shoulders. He also had claws on his fingertips and toes that were retractable. Around his neck there were two red tufts that also appeared around his wrists. His hair was very long in this form, reaching waist length, and his hollow mask was completely different from what we had ever seen. It covered Ichigo's entire head and had black markings on it, as well as two demonic looking horns that protruded from it. In terms of power, it was just insane. Its strength was immense, this form moved at unimaginable speeds, his spirit power, which as we know was insane, increased further and drastically. As well as that, this form came with very high speed regeneration and of course with an enhanced Sero. A Sero that was able to completely overwhelm Ukiura's Sero. In the Vasto Lorde form, the battle was over. Completely. Ukiura went from the most terrifying thing we had ever seen to being completely destroyed in a very brutal manner by this new form. Ichigo was eventually returned to normal, but he was completely shocked by the absolute devastation that he had just caused. All he could do in this moment was look on as Ukiura passed away. So after this fight, Ichigo and Captain Urahara return to the fake Karakura town where she heals and replenishes Ichigo's energy. She explains the power of Aizen's Shikai and tells Ichigo that he is now the only one who can defeat him since he is the only one who hasn't seen it. Thus, he won't be able to succumb to its hypnosis power. It's the only true advantage that the Soul Reapers had at this point and one that they couldn't afford to lose at any cost. Upon arriving, Ichigo attempts to cut down Aizen in one blow, but his strike is blocked by a barrier. Aizen tries to unnerve Ichigo with his words, but luckily Komamura steps in just as Ichigo was starting to lose himself. Now, all Ichigo can do here is wait for an opening while the other Soul Reapers take Aizen on. He eventually finds one after Aizen and Yamamoto have gone at it and strikes Aizen with a Getsuga Tensho. Unfortunately, this isn't enough as the Hogyoku heals the wounds that Aizen had suffered. He does get a compliment from Aizen in regards to his spirit power and how much he has grown in power himself, but tries to play the mind games with Ichigo again, saying that his growth has all gone according to his plans and that he had been watching Ichigo from his very birth. Everything Ichigo had done up to this point, including the battles he had had, Aizen claimed to have been and taken place exactly as he wished. Luckily, Ichigo's father Ishin steps in before Ichigo's anger boils over too much. He takes Ichigo away from Aizen's location, explains the whole "I'm a Soul Reaper" thing, sorry about keeping that a secret, before leaving back to Aizen's location where Ichigo's next big test begins in Gin Ichimaru. Now, the fight with Gin is an interesting one, especially when we know what its true purpose was, in the fact that it was a test from Gin to see if Ichigo was ready to defeat Aizen. Obviously, Ichigo is not ready at this point as Gin is the stronger of the two, but there is something Ichigo will still go on to do. Now, while in the Bankai, Ishin instructs Ichigo that he must learn the final Getsuga Tensho. Not only does he need to learn this, but he has to do it within 3 months. This is a technique that the spirit of his Zanpakuto will not be pleased to hear him speak of. Ishin continues to say that this is a technique that their Zanpakuto spirits will be reluctant to teach them, as Ichigo will find out why. Ichigo goes on to confront the true spirit of his Zanpakuto. This is the inner hollow who is now fused or merged with the other being inhabiting the inner world representing his Quincy powers, who of course refuses to teach Ichigo this technique. Despite Ichigo's pleas that he must protect Karakura Town at all costs, the spirit tells him that they are both protecting different things. So the two fight and Ichigo figures out the technique and more importantly the cost of the final Getsuga Tensho, which is that if he uses this technique, it will come at the cost of his own Soul Reaper powers. Now, the final Getsuga Tensho works in the same way as a normal Getsuga Tensho. A Getsuga Tensho blast consumes some of Ichigo's spirit energy and condenses that into an attack. The final Getsuga Tensho is the same in that it consumes Ichigo's spirit energy and uses it as an attack. However, it consumes all of Ichigo's spirit energy and thus he will lose his Soul Reaper powers for good. So, Ichigo returns from the Bankai in a new form. It's not the final Getsuga Tensho form, but what a lot of people call Bankai Ichigo. Here, his hair is longer and his clothing is also slightly different. His right hand is covered in a black glove and the chain from the hilt of his Zanpakuto spirals up to the length of Ichigo's arm. His Zanpakuto looks similar to that it did in his Bankai with some slight changes, mainly the crossguard. It still has the same shape as the manji, but the prongs are much thinner here. Now, Ichigo's presence when he arrives in Karakura Town is nothing short of epic. Gin also acknowledges that Ichigo is now ready to defeat Aizen because he now has that look in his eyes. The battle with Aizen begins and Ichigo destroys a shocked and stunned Aizen. For Ichigo, he knows that he must use the final Getsuga Tensho quickly, as at this point Aizen had become immortal and that he was constantly evolving, becoming stronger and stronger himself. That time in the battle also quickly approached and Ichigo activates the final Getsuga Tensho. In this form, Ichigo just looks absolutely insane. His hair becomes jet black and grows in length to waist length. His body becomes covered in light bluish grey bandages covering his torso, right arm and his face just beneath his eyes. Black flame markings also appear from his chest and wrap around his left arm. Here Ichigo is constantly emitting black Ryatsu, with the majority of it focusing around his right arm. You'll notice that he is not wielding a sword in this form, and that is because he has now fused with Zangetsu itself. The final Getsuga Tensho shakes Aizen to the absolute core. He is in a state of complete disbelief as he sees that Ichigo has evolved to a plane beyond that of a Soul Reaper. He continues to question himself as he asks if Ichigo is now on a higher plane than he himself is. Ichigo then spreads his right hand out and a black form of spirit energy forms as Ichigo says Mugetsu. Mugetsu is translated as meaning moonless sky and is the final attack. A blade of black spiritual energy is generated in his hand that he then swings at the target. Remember, this attack is like a Getsuga Tensho, however it draws all of Ichigo's spiritual energy rather than just a portion of it. This creates a huge wall of black energy to erupt, heading straight towards its target. The skies are blackened and extreme damage is caused to any and everything that is in its path. Even still, the energy will continue to rise before it eventually disappears into the sky. Now, this move doesn't kill the immortal Aizen, of course, but severely wounds and weakens him enough that Urahara can bind him with a very strong Kido spell. The win goes to Ichigo, but at the cost of his Soul Reaper powers. Now, 17 months after defeating Aizen, Ichigo is struggling to come to terms with the loss of his power, which comes during the Fullbring arc. We come across a method called Fullbring that will allow Ichigo to regain his Soul Reaper powers. Ichigo was able to store spirit power in an item, which in his case was his Soul Reaper badge. This allowed Ichigo to finally learn how to control spirit energy without leaking it like he always had. Ichigo's attachment and emotions tied with the badge and what it represents to him from his pride in being a Soul Reaper allowed him to awaken his Fullbring powers. Now, Fullbring powers allow one to bring out the full potential of an item or piece of equipment that they have a strong affinity with. From his Soul Reaper badge, black spirit energy emits from it that form the shape of a Tsuba. This first stage of his Fullbring is mainly for defense, where he can block incoming attacks coming his way. Later, his Fullbring powers evolve further in that they change his appearance and his powers also evolve. His whole body is now covered in this black spirit energy and produce a black blade that forms over his right arm. His abilities here are referred to as a clad type due to the fact that Ichigo was covered in his own power, much like his Bankai used to be when his clothing represented how much spiritual power that he had left. Once his Fullbring training was completed, Ichigo's power transforms into a white armor that covers his chest, shoulders, arms and feet with a stripe that ran across his face. Under this was a black bodysuit. In this form, Ichigo can turn his Soul Reaper badge into a sword of its own. Now, through Fullbring, Ichigo began to regain his Soul Reaper powers a little bit at a time, and once those powers return, his Fullbring and Soul Reaper powers will fuse together. However, Ichigo is betrayed by Ginjo, who had been helping Ichigo learn the Fullbring technique. Ginjo stole Ichigo's Fullbring, and Ichigo pleaded for him to give his powers back to him. He wasn't going to lose his powers again, not after he had worked so hard to get them back. Now, it is here where Rukia stabs Ichigo in the back with a reishi blade that has the spirit power of several different Soul Reapers. The fact that Ichigo can now see Rukia here means that Ichigo had now finally regained his Soul Reaper powers and he takes on a brand new form. Those Fullbring powers have indeed merged with that of his Soul Reaper powers. His appearance is a mix between that of his Fullbring armor and his Soul Reaper clothing. The appearance of his Shikai is also different here. The shape, color, and hilt all look like an upgraded and of course merged version of that of his Fullbring powers. Now, the Fullbring arc is one that a lot of fans didn't really get on board with or truly understand. I personally can see the flaws in the arc, but I also see what the arc was about. It was progression for Ichigo, but not so much in a sense of power, but a huge mental development for him, and I really loved seeing that progression in his character. The reason we spoke about it in this video is to highlight that not only did Ichigo go from losing his powers after using Mugetsu against Aizen to regaining them when stabbed by the Reishi blade, but he went from nothing to more powerful than he was. So for me, there is still progression in his powers here too. Final thing to mention on the Fullbring powers before we move on is the change it also made on his Bankai. Look-wise, it was amazing and similar to that of his Shikai in terms of, it being a clear mix or fusion between that of what we knew of his Bankai and the theme of his Fullbring powers. But the coolest thing for me was definitely that of his sword. His sword became more curved and had 3 separate protrusions along its blunt end closer to the tip of the sword. The chain of Tenza Zangetsu also became longer, attaching to the hilt of the blade and Ichigo's glove. This takes us to the events of the 1,000-year Blood War arc. Ichigo is sent to the Soul Society in order to save it and confronts Yua, who's of course the big bad here, like the biggest bad we've had in Bleach. Crazy. Ichigo learns that it was him who had ordered the destruction of the Serite and in his anger goes on the offensive. The difference in power between these two is far too great and Yuha completely overwhelms and takes Ichigo down with ease. Now, we do see one of Ichigo's Quincy abilities on show here that he had of course inherited from his mother's side called Blutvein, which is German for blood vein. Yuha goes to stab Ichigo, but he is saved by this ability. This ability, there are 2 bloods, and this is the defensive one. When Ichigo was imprisoned by Opie, it transferred some of his Ryatsu to Ichigo that had awakened the Quincy power that his mother had left to him. Within that power also lied memories, giving him access to this ability. So this ability allowed him to survive the stabbing attack from Yuha, leaving only a small cut compared to the fatal blow that it would have been. This power is also used to help Ichigo when he sustains critical wounds he has taken and can stop the huge loss of blood that the wound would have caused. Of course, we actually saw this way back when in his first fight with Kenpachi, as the then Zangetsu used this ability to help stop the bleeding from the wound that Ichigo had suffered by Kenpachi's blade, so that he could fight together with Zangetsu to battle Kenpachi. The battle with Yuha continues, and as he tries to leave, Ichigo attempts to prevent him. However, Jugram cuts the blade of his Bankai sword Tenza Zangetsu clean in 2, leaving Ichigo completely powerless. Ichigo survives but learns through Mayuri that a broken Bankai can never be fixed. However, the Royal Guard arrive who take Ichigo to the Soul King Palace in order for his Bankai to be reforged. After healing and having his powers not only restored and increased, Ichigo and Renji are sent to Nemaya's place, where the two are forced to fight the Asachi in order for them to have their Zanpakuto reforged. After 3 days, Ichigo had failed to defeat the Asachi, and Nemaya sends him back to the human world, where Isshin reveals the truth about his mother being a Quincy and the circumstances around her death. With this truth, Ichigo returns to Nemaya's place. He watches the forging of his new Zanpakuto, and Ichigo learns the truth about the beings in his inner world. He learns that the old man he thought he knew as Zangetsu wasn't actually Zangetsu, but the being who represented his Quincy powers. In his inner world, as he searched for answers, he finds out that his inner hollow is actually his true Zanpakuto. The real Zangetsu he had been mostly suppressing all this time. After this reveal, Zangetsu allows Ichigo access to the full power of his Zanpakuto, and in the real world, Ichigo's true Zanpakuto is forged. So his Shikai comes in the form of 2 separate black swords. One is the size of his previous sword that we are all very familiar with, and the second blade is like that of a knife. So the larger blade represents his inner hollow that we now know as the true Zangetsu and is his true Zanpakuto. The smaller blade represents the old man that Ichigo had acknowledged as Zangetsu all this time and is the manifested spirit of Ichigo's Quincy powers. Now, Ichigo's true Shikai powers are both energy attacks. The first is of course the Getsuga Tensho we are all familiar with. Ichigo can fire a Getsuga Tensho blast with both of his swords. With the smaller blade, he simply points it towards his target and makes a small slashing motion. The bigger sword is the more powerful of the two, and when used with this blade, the color of the Getsuga Tensho attack is completely black. Now, Ichigo also has the move called Getsuga Jujisho, which is translated as meaning Moon Fang Cross-Shaped Piercer. Here, he will fire a Getsuga Tensho with each of his blades at the same time in a crossed motion. This fuses the two Getsuga Tensho blasts into one insane attack. Now, a lot of course happens in the 1000-year Blood War arc when it comes to the question of Ichigo's powers and how strong is he, but the big thing that we should probably focus on in this arc is of course the final battle with Urahara, so let's skip ahead to then. So in his final battle against Urahara, Ichigo entered a new hollow form. After learning the truth about his powers and he had gained his reforged Zanpakuto, Ichigo's hollow and Quincy powers were in balance with one another. This balance can be disrupted, allowing Ichigo to merge with his inner hollow, which causes a very powerful transformation, which we see here in this fight. This is Ichigo's merged hollow form. The left side of his face and neck changed to look like that of his Vasto Lorde form when he fought against Ukiura. That left eye becomes black with the yellow iris, like when he was using his holification powers. He also gains a singular white horn, again like that of the Vasto Lorde form, and his Zanpakuto becomes pure white in color. This form completely skyrockets Ichigo's overall power in terms of his speed, strength, and spiritual power. Now, the big boy attack in this form is his combined Gran Rei Sero Getsuga Tensho, which is where he will use his Zangetsu blade as a second horn. Using his own blood as a power supply, Ichigo is able to fire a Gran Rei Sero and combine it with a Getsuga Tensho. This created a blast so powerful that it was enough to wound Urahara. However, this wound was easily patted down by him, but he does take Ichigo a lot more seriously from now on. The battle between these two is amazing, and Urahara is literally on another level. However, with the help of Aizen of all people, who tricks Urahara using the power of Kyokusui Getsu into thinking he had defeated both Ichigo and Renji, the non-illusion, aka the real Ichigo, is bought just enough time to get behind Urahara and cuts him clean in half with a very powerful golden Getsuga Tensho blast. Thus, he defeats this incredibly powerful opponent, the most powerful opponent we have seen in all of Bleach. Now, the final thing to talk about with Ichigo's power and abilities is his Bankai. Now he has his true Zanpakuto. To activate his Bankai, Ichigo places the two blades of his Shikai together, creating a surge of energy around him and the swords. Now, the power of Ichigo's true Tensa Zangetsu is currently unknown, but we do know that he is considered extremely dangerous. We also know that he can fire an enhanced Getsuga Tensho. This is much more powerful than a normal one and is also gold in color, the one that finished off Urahara. But unfortunately, that is all we know for now. So just how strong is Ichigo? Well, that's an answer we don't really have as of yet due to the fact he is still getting stronger and stronger. There seems to be absolutely no limit to what he can achieve, and just when you think that he is at the peak of his powers, he will find a new way to surpass that. We obviously know that he is without a doubt not only one of the strongest characters in the series, but also one of the strongest characters in all of anime. So I hope this video allowed you to understand just how strong he is by pointing out these key points in his story and by highlighting his powers and abilities. This was easily one beast mode of a video to make, so if you've made it this far, big props to you and thanks, it truly means a lot. Let us know in the comment section below what your favorite power of Ichigo's is and which of his fights you enjoyed the most. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more Bleach videos on the channel, make sure to let us know by smashing that like button. If you haven't already, make this the video you subscribe and hit that notification bell to turn on all notifications or you will miss future Anime Uproar videos. Whilst you wait for more Bleach videos to drop on the channel, make sure to check out our ever-growing Bleach playlist that includes videos on all Bankai, all Shikai, the captains ranked weakest to strongest, and much more. Link to that is in the video description below. Until next time, my friends, take care of yourselves. Peace!